Enjoy working with the folks here in Wauwatosa, and I think that the district is doing some very exciting and well-needed work in this area, and I think they need to be a leader in this area. I think a lot of people will look towards it. So I really want to just say, look, tonight I would like to just start rethinking grading. We've all been graded. For those of us who are in education, we've given grades. And we're constantly changing things. We're changing cutoff points, and what's an A is now 93%, and B is, and we're always doing things like that. Right? We're trying to figure out what's the perfect weighting. And a lot of the stuff that we've done in grading over the last 10 years has really been sort of the best analogy I can think of is kind of like rearranging deck chairs in the Titanic. It doesn't actually change the direction of the boat, right? It's just cosmetic for the most part. And so if we really want to change grading, we have to think really about the nuts and bolts of it. What's going on? And so the first question is, why do we grade? Do you need a grade to learn something? Absolutely not. You know, people learn stuff all the time without receiving a grade. You do not need, grading is not necessary to the learning process. If you think it is, you're wrong. It's absolutely not. But we do give grades, and we give them all the time. We give them in the work world, the real world, right? But why do we give them? Because why we do something, the purpose for doing something is very important. And unless we actually go back and talk about why we're doing something, we can never really make it better. And so I've listed a few examples here. There's probably more. But I'd like you to kind of take a look at this list. Communicate achievement to students and their parents and others. Provide information, so on and so forth. Just take a minute and read through those, and then I'm going to ask you which one you think is the most important. Just trying to get a sense. We won't even say the most. We'll say, what's in your top two? Okay, show of hands. Who thinks number one? Okay. Well, 20% of the people, 25% of the people. Who says number two? Okay, a lot more. Hands go up. Okay. Number three. Okay. Few people. Right, select, identify. Number four. Okay. Number five. All right. Number six. One person. All right, that's okay. So, I don't know if you looked around the room, but there were a pretty good group of hands that went up for all of these. So this is one of the biggest problems about grading, is we don't all agree about what the purpose is. And some of these things are antagonistic, right? If you're talking about providing a mechanism to compare students, you want to know who's the top student, right? What does that mean? What are you saying when you say that is our purpose, right? That is saying that you hope that not everybody reaches a high level of achievement. Because if everybody reaches the same high level of achievement, you can't do number five. Number six, do you want to provide evidence, lack of effort, inappropriate responsibility? Is that the same as number one? So again, these are all things that we have to decide what's important. And some of the things, you may want grades to do multiple things, but you're going to have to decide which one is absolutely most important. I think Phil just kind of said, look, we really want to talk about achievement. Right? So when we talk about a lot of stuff tonight, we're going to be, that's what kind of the district I think is coming from. And I think that's a good place. It's a good place. Now, one of the main problems in trying to meet multiple purposes is this. So your kid comes home, or you come home, let's say you're taking a class, or you're back in school. And I look at it and it says, okay, Gerry got a 82% in Algebra 1, or Algebra 2. What are some some different scenarios that describe how I ended up with a final grade of 82%. Turn to your neighbor, talk to your neighbor a little bit. Just try and think of some different examples of, okay, what are all the different ways a student could come home with a grade of 82%? Right? And if you're not near a neighbor, just try and think of a couple of different ways. So just take a minute, just talk with your neighbor. Introduce yourself, say, hey, you look great tonight, by the way, and here's my example, all right? Okay, let's see if any of these sound familiar. Did anyone have a scenario like this? Gerry scored really high in all the major tests, but he has a problem keeping up with his day-to-day work, and he didn't turn in about half the homework assignments. You get a 0, so that 0 brings it down. So, he got really high in all the tests, but his homework grade was really low. Anyone think of that scenario? A few people. What about the flip scenario? Gerry makes sure he gets every assignment, goes to every pep rally. If there's a can drive, he's bringing in a can of soup, get that extra 5 points. Right? But his tests, he's kind of in that sort of C range, low 70s area. Anyone think of that scenario? Gets really well in the participation grade, gets those full participation points, gotta get those participation points. The point is, it's not that this number doesn't mean anything. It's that it could mean several things. And therein lies the problem with grades, as we traditionally think about them. Because we try to do so many things with one number. Right? We want to hold students responsible for doing the work and making their deadlines. How many of you guys have ever had a punctuality grade in a course you took? Who had a punctuality grade? Right, a couple people? Everyone's hand should be up for this, because how many of you took a college class or high school class or whatever class and it said for every day late, finish the sentence for me, 10% will be deducted. It was an A paper on Monday and it is a B paper on Tuesday. That is a punctuality grade. That's a penalty, but it is a punctuality grade. Make no mistake about it. Anyone who tells you anything different is deluding themselves. That is a punctuality grade. And yet, you can find that in any syllabus, at any college, any high school, any district. In some cases, some districts mandate it. But again, you have to go back to your purpose. Almost nobody put up their hand for number 6, but that is exactly what that policy is. But we're fine with it. You say, oh yeah, you gotta have it. Gotta teach responsibility. If that was true, that grades as a punishment teach kids responsibility, we wouldn't have that problem, right? It would have worked itself out by the time they get to college. It doesn't. That's a false notion. Now, the reason that we just kind of talk about this is when we talk about grades, we really are grading on 3 different things. When we assign a grade, we're grading on 3 different things. We're grading on product, which is what can a student do in a domain, whether it's art or music or math or writing, doesn't matter. Right? So what can they show that they can do? What is their degree of mastery or grasp or whatever word you want to use in a specific domain? Right? Not just can they do math problems, but what's the complexity of math problems that they can do? Then we have process criteria, because process is very important. Right? All those things like making deadlines, being punctual, participating in class, getting along well with others, working well in groups, all these sorts of things contribute to people's success in a learning environment. And that's why we grade them, because we want people to do them. And we think if we assign points to them, then they'll take it seriously, and then hopefully they'll learn them. But process and product are not the same thing. You can have a student who could walk in the first day of class and blow any test you give them out of the water, but they are the most difficult human being to be around. Right? They make everyone else in the class cranky. Right? They're insulting, they're rude, but maybe they know calculus. Right? And so we dig them on that other stuff, because we say that's important, not just for school, but for life. I mean, all of you folks, how many of you would hire a student, a worker for your company that didn't have all those process elements, couldn't make deadlines, couldn't keep up with things, couldn't get along well with others? Right? What are parents all? I'm a parent. What do you often ask your son or daughter's teacher if you go in and see him? You don't just ask them how they're doing in terms of the work. You want to know, hey, are they not being a pain? Are they getting along? How they interact with everybody in the class. You want to know those things because those things are important, but they're different. And the last one is progress. All right, I'll give you an example. Little Johnny comes into the beginning of the school year, and he's reading at a second grade level. And after the first 9 weeks, little Johnny is now reading at a third grade level. What grade do you want to give him for language arts? It's not a trick question. What grade do you guys want to give him? A plus. Hey, who doesn't want to give Johnny an A? Put up your hand. You have no soul. You are a heartless person, right? Well, let me. Okay, you're probably thinking of this. What if little Johnny is in 5th grade? Ooh, but do we really want to give little Johnny an F? You got no soul if you want to give Johnny an F either, right? I mean, think about that. The kid went up an entire grade level in 9 weeks, and you recognize this achievement by saying F. So what do teachers do? We monkey around with the system and we try and get it because we know that would be devastating. That would be absolutely devastating. And so we grade on progress sometimes, because we have to. And none of these things is a bad thing to grade on. None of them. When you guys have employee evaluations wherever you work, you probably get evaluated on different things, right? They recognize your growth. They recognize how you interact in the office, right, or within a team. They recognize your competency in a specific domain. They don't try to. You can't do it all with one number. How could you do it all with one number? And it doesn't matter if it's a percentage or a letter or a star or yellow clovers or blue diamonds. It doesn't matter what you use. You can't do all of this in any sort of valid way with one number, because people will always ask, which one is it? And so really when we talk about grading, we talk about standards-based grading, grading for learning, or whatever name you want to put on it. Well, if we want to rethink grading, we have to say, you know what? Maybe we should stop trying to combine all of these things. They're all important, but we can't combine. We can't combine. I call that the Ghostbusters rule. Right? How many of you guys have seen Ghostbusters? Right? So they're going in to the hotel, and they're about to take on the first ghost, and Egon there in the back, rest in peace Egon, we lost it this year. Egon says, important safety tip, fellas, don't cross the streams. 3 Ghostbusters, 3 streams, don't cross them, keep them separate. Keep them separate. If you went to your doctor, and your doctor was describing your health, and try to average your weight with your height, with your cholesterol, with your, whatever, your blood pressure, it would be nuts. Right? You wouldn't be able to do anything with that information. They're all important, but they're distinct. Keep them separate. And that's when I think about rethinking grading, I always ask, well, why do we have to do this? And not give people C's or use letter grades. Why do we have to put one grade on something? Who said we had to do that? What universal rule says we have to put one grade on anything? How would you describe it? Everyone seen Rudy? I like these movies. Rudy? Everyone seen Rudy here? Right? Rudy. So how would you describe Rudy? What if you were going to score Rudy strictly on his ability as a football player? What grade would you give Rudy? A D at best, right? But he did make the farm team. But does that really describe Rudy? Is that fair to Rudy? I'd like to think about this. If I were really going to be accurate, I might describe Rudy with several things. I might say, this is his overall academic performance. He wasn't the best student, but he was there. Football skill, But look at these other things, these process things. That's where Rudy really, that's where he shined. I don't know if a good life skill is the ability to absorb physical punishment, but hey, that's what he had. Right? But we don't have to use one score. Right? We don't have to do it. If we want to rethink grading, we need to rethink why are we combining all this stuff? What are we doing with it? And we've done this. Lots of places do this. Canada's been doing it for years. You can go around the world and find examples of this. This is an example we did in Kentucky. We said, okay, you've got achievement. That's what we're going to use to calculate GPA and all that other stuff. But if it's important, put it on the report card. Communicate it. So we asked some teachers, we said, well, what's really important? And they said, homework. Students doing their homework, absolutely essential. I said, okay, great, we're going to put it on the report card. How they use the class time. That's important. Right? Are you skylarking around and is that a word you guys use up here? Skylarking? I'm from Bermuda, so that's how they would always say, the teacher would say, stop skylarking. So I don't know, you guys probably have no idea what that means. It sounds like a made up word, but it's a real word. It basically means messing around. Right? Cooperation with peers and adults. All of those things are absolutely crucial. They're not the same thing. So what I did is I went through, after these teachers, we didn't tell them how to determine it. You figure it out. You determine all of that. But afterwards I went back with about these 50 teachers, and I took a correlation, and I looked at what was the correlation between achievement and the homework scores, and achievement and use of class time, and achievement and cooperation with peers and adults. So we're going to play a little game right now. So absolutely, the correlation goes between 0 and 1. Well, 1 means a perfect correlation. It lines up perfectly. Every time a student gets an A in achievement, they're getting a 4 in homework. A 0 means there's absolutely no relationship whatsoever. Absolutely none. Doesn't matter. The two are totally unrelated. So between 0 and 1, what do you think the correlation between achievement and homework was for these teachers? Just take a guess based on your past life experience. Take a second. Between 0 and 1, is it a 0.9, a 0.1, 0.4? Who wants to venture a brave guess? 0.5. 0.5. What do you think? 0.2. Did I hear 0.9? 0.9. All over the place. Right? These are based on our predictions of our past experiences, our real sort of world life. My guess is because we know that there's lots of reasons why students do and do not do homework. Right? For these teachers, the gentleman in the back is correct. It was 0.5. It might be totally different if you did it with the grades here in Wauwatosa. The point is, it's not the same thing. It's related, but it's not the same thing. Some students don't do well on homework because they don't understand it. They can't do it. So they don't turn it in. Some students are bored by it. They don't really see the point. They get it. Some students have busy after-school lives. Right? Maybe they're on a traveling sports team. Maybe they got to take care of siblings. But we don't know. There's lots of different things. We don't know how much parental help they get. We don't know how much peer help they get. I'm sure nobody in this room has ever copied down an assignment before going into a class. Right? Nobody in this room has ever done that? You probably, how many of you knew somebody that did that? Right? We all know somebody who did that, right? Oh yeah, well I saw, Jimmy Smith one time, he copied down my homework answers. Right? So there's a disconnect there. All right, what about use of class time? What do you guys think about that one? Use of class time. What's the venture a brave guess for that one? 0.6. 0.6. 0.3. Anyone else? It was 0.4 for these teachers. Whew. A student might be able to goof off in class but still perform well on the assessments. Or a student might be able to work really hard every day and not do quite as well as you thought. They're related, but not the same thing. When you combine different sort of vectors, you add noise to the signal. And if what we're trying to do is communicate about someone's performance, you're just adding more noise when you start to combine all these things. All right, last one. Cooperation with peers and adults. 0.2. Anyone else? It was 0.3 for these teachers. Now, who here is going to say that cooperation with peers and adults is not important? Anybody? There's one, cooperation with peers. That person probably doesn't get along with many people at work. Think about it. As a life skill, that's important.
What about different personality types?
Does that matter? We work with people that have different personality types. There's probably a lot of different personality types in this room.
Are you grading based off of that?
Exactly. But we do it all the time. That's my point. We do it all the time. We grade on how well people get along with other people all the time, and we lump it all together. We don't even do a separate grade. We lump it right in there. Participation. What do you think participation is? Participation, you are grading cooperation with peers and adults. If someone can't get along with anyone in the classroom and they're disruptive and whatnot, they're going to get a low participation grade. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying it's different than achievement. It's different than achievement. Yes?
You're saying that you want to have different scores and more communication for different processes, products, and progress. However, if I go in public school right now, I have even less information than I've ever had before, and that's the point that is bothering me right now.
Well, I'll come back to that. But by less information, a lot of people think less precision, less percentages, less scores. You can put all that stuff in. We tell schools all the time, hey, homework, put it in. Participation, put in the grade book. Weight it to 0 though. If your academic grade is about achievement, you are doing a disservice by not weighting that stuff to 0. If you are counting that in the grade, you have violated the core purpose that you have said about that academic grade. So that's my point there. Now, if we want to talk about we're lacking precision, not enough information, all right, this is some more data. This is from 2 high schools, sort of in Kentucky. This is from geometry class. Because people like math. People like to use math in these examples. Because we think of math as being more precise, right? More information, more variation. It's going to give us better data. And the way this district is set up is they say that 40% of the grade is based on the formative assessments. These are like the homeworks, little exit slips, pop quizzes, small assessments, things like that. Summative assessments are their big major projects, exams, papers, that sort of thing. Right? So as we can see that there is a relationship, positive relationship, with what they do over here and these things down here. But if we look at any sort of band level, so let's take the students that are scoring in that 55 to 65% range on the summative assessments. And if we go over there and we look at the range of grades on their homeworks, those sorts of things, it ranges from 40% to 100%. So that student at the very top would get a B, and a student at the very bottom, a little bit over there to the right, will get an F. Even though the student at the bottom over there to the right scored higher on the summative assessments. This is what I mean by mixing the signals. Got to separate these out. Now, there's lots of different ways you can do this. But the point is, we got to rethink about separating them. And this idea of mathematical precision, right? Grading using mathematical precision and lots of levels is false. We have research dating back to 1912 that shows the more levels we introduce, the more subjective factors come into play. You can go and look up some studies by some fellows named Elliott and Starch. They did this. They took papers, took about 200 papers, sent it out to teachers, told them to score it, brought it back. Huge variation. They did it with English language arts teachers. People said, well, that's too subjective of an area. They repeated the study the next year with math papers, found even greater variation. Greater variation. Actually, I'll just go ahead and jump over to that one, and I'll come back to this. 100 years later, we can repeat the same thing. So this was actually done, we did this in Iowa, or a colleague of mine did this in Iowa. So he took this problem, gave it to 40 certified math teachers, said, imagine this problem is on a quiz, and said, it's worth 10 points. How many points are you going to assign to a student? And here are 4 sample pieces of student work. Didn't give them any directions, didn't let them talk to each other. Let's look and see what came back. Okay, for student A, this was the distribution of scores. So what does that mean? It means depending on whose class you were in, you extrapolated this out to an entire exam. If you were in one teacher's class, you might get an A. If you were in another teacher's class, you might get a C. That's what that means. Exactly what Elliott and Starch found. Student C. And last one, student D. I still can't figure out why that group of teachers gave that student a 9 and not a 10. My best guess is because the student forgot their calculator, which, by the way, is what type of grade? It's a process grade, responsibility. That student should have gotten full credit. But what we know is anytime we try to introduce more levels of variation, we actually increase the subjective factors that go into a score. Right? That's why in the Olympics, when they have judges, what do? They throw out the high and low, right? Because they're trying to keep that subjectivity from influencing. So in terms of feedback, if you really want to get feedback about how a student's doing it down to the detail level, a grade book is not the place to do that. You should look at the assessment and the test and the quiz that the teachers hand back. They give feedback, they write comments, they circle errors, they do that sort of thing. That is where you want to capture that sort of detailed atomic level feedback. Right? We just want to capture an overall sort of placement. And adding more levels does not make that more accurate. Right? This is why we often convert percentage scores into GPA things, because we're trying to reduce that level of variation in subjectivity. That's why we do it. Going back to this example, I pulled out one class from this group. This is from an honors geometry class. And basically what I separated those summative and formative scores. I said, okay, let's take a look at this honors geometry class. And here's the percentage, these are the points right out of the teacher's book. So you can see the top line there. That's how they scored in all those little assessments. And so each sort of 2 points pair there is a student. So that first student, that's how they scored on the formatives. The red dot, the red square is how they scored on the summatives. We go across there. Well, what do we know about students who are usually in honors geometry. They're go-getters, right? They're by any means necessary. They want to get that. They're very honed in. So they're going to do all the little assignments, and even if they have to work with somebody else, they're going to get all that stuff done. But look at how they perform on the summative assessments, the big major ones. It's a big variation. But what happens when we clump these two together? If we look at the total grades, the students up here on the left, sort of the top third performers in the class, and not too much difference between their summative and their formatives, their practice stuff. If we go way down to the end here, those students down there. So we've got a student who, on the summative, is scoring about 67%. But when we lump in all that other stuff, it bumps them up to an 85. So what happens to that student? What are you communicating to that student? You're saying, hey, you're fine, you're ready. That's a solid B. Now we're going to send you on into honors algebra. And then you're going to hit that first large enrollment, college algebra, calculus course when you get to college, where they just score you on 2 midterms and a final, and the floor is going to drop out from underneath it. Because the grade has not done the job of communicating what that student knows in that domain. And we kind of went through this one. Now, the other part of grading, rethinking grading, standards-based grading, a lot of times when people hear standards-based grading, they think, wow, this is about Common Core or some other, but it's nothing to do with that. And that doesn't matter. What it's about is coherent judgment. It's coherent. The standard is setting a standard for saying, you know what? This is what our expectation is. This is what achievement looks like. And if you go around now to any of the departments, you will hear very different conversations as it relates to grades, because teachers are talking about the qualities of evidence, not 2 points here or 3 points here. Those are meaningless discussions. They miss the point. I like to say that grading is not like Fleetwood Mac. You can't go your own way. You're part of a team. You need to act like you're part of a team. You need to work together. And actually, a lot of accrediting agencies for schools have made this an equity issue. They said, you know what, if you do not actively have teachers think about criterion reference, not norm reference, we're not in the business of trying to say this student's better than that student. I mean, if you want to do that with grades, sure, that's your prerogative, but that's not what we're trying to do. We don't come up with criterion-based standards of what we want to see. That is an equity issue. Because it's going to mean that students are getting different levels of expectations, and that leads to different quality and rigor of instruction. And I would say you can ask, what does an A look like? Because you can't say an A is 93%. 93% doesn't mean anything. Percentages without context are meaningless. They are. I'll give you a few examples. So let's say I taught physics, so I'm given a quiz on density, water displacement, that sort of thing, buoyancy. So this is my question here. Which block is more dense? What do you guys think? Which block is more dense? It's not a trick question. Which one? The other, right? It's low in the water, same volume, whatnot. Right. So now across the hall, this gentleman here is given a physics test as well, except the questions on his test look like this. Now, I'm not going to ask you to answer that question, but let me ask you, whose classroom do you hope you're in? Think about it. You hope you're in my classroom, because I'm throwing out softballs. Whose class are you going to learn more in? Just because if he's asking questions like this on his test, that means he probably taught to this level. He exposed students to this type of question, this type of thinking. Right? So this is what the standard and standards-based grading is about. Right? It's about coming together and saying, let's talk about what the expectation is. Let's talk about the complexity of the work, what it looks like. What does the performance look like? All right, another question for the group here. Just kind of see where you guys are. 70%. Is this a high grade? So who thinks this is a high grade? And you guys probably realize this is a trick question by now, right? If you got this on the AP exam, you would get a 5. The highest score possible. You would get a 5. And we forget that all the time. We always talk about AP, this, whatever, and then we say, oh, we can't, we have to have high percent. But no, 70% gets you a 5. Why does it get you a 5? Because they ask questions like this and not like this. And so if your discussions start with percentages and start with this idea, this is how we're going to do these things, you're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. You gotta start with, what does it look like? What do you want it to mean? What should be the qualities of the evidence that students produce? So again, this is one of the reasons we move away from percentages. Sort of reporting. Again, because we go back to that previous one, what's very subjective is how we assign partial credit. Totally subjective. I remember a differential equations class in college. There were 2 sections. And my instructor, if you made a mistake early on, everything else was wrong in his eyes. So you would go through these. These problems would like take up like a page and a half, and you'd be sitting there sweating, and but you made one little sort of sign error up here, and he would say, "Oh, well, this is a 1 out of 10." He would say, "Come on, man, I know it better than a 1 out of 10. I made this thing." He said, "Well, nothing else can be right." The guy across the hall, he was a little bit more generous. But again, so that's why we condense levels. That's why percentages are such a bad way to think about things, because percentages are contextual. And you have some assessments where you expect proficient or just passing to be 100%. And you have other things where the pass rate might be 50%. It depends. So if we make percentages our reporting and our language that we talk about grades, it totally nullifies all that, because then we have to assume that all percentages are equal, and they're absolutely not. Absolutely not. Context matters. That's why we often use rubrics and scores. Right? We describe evidence, levels of evidence, tiers of evidence. That's how we do it. How many of you, anybody here done a dissertation or master's thesis? You got a percentage score on that? Nope. Why? Because that's not what it's about. Do you get feedback on it? Do you get challenged on it? Do you get dinged on it? Do you have to go back and revise it? Oh yeah, of course you do. Right? Is it being graded? Oh yes. But we don't always have to focus on points. If you make the focus on points, again, it's just the wrong conversation. It's the wrong conversation. Because then it becomes about gathering points, right? Not about deciding, okay, what do I need to know? Now, one of the other dirty things that comes up when we talk about grading is retakes. This is one of the most vicious things. Right? Because retakes, when we say, okay, we're not teaching responsibility or other sorts of things, but we have very good research that shows that this approach is beneficial for learning. What's the point? Is the point to learn, or is the point to reward who gets it first? Did anyone, when we talked about purposes, did anyone think the purpose of a grade is to indicate who gets it first? Right? We don't. We wouldn't do that anywhere else. How many of you failed your driver's license the first time? Okay, so let's take out your driver's license. I got a Sharpie, and I'm going to come around there and say, this person failed the first time. In fact, we're going to make a little sticker you can wear on your shirt. Right? Well, what if you took 2 times to pass your driver's license, and then someone said to you, you know what, you failed it the first time, so you can only drive in your neighborhood. Right? You would be like, that's ludicrous. So what are we kind of measuring there? Now, if you go in, give a straight lecture, whatever, send people home, bring them back, say, here's a quiz at the end of the week. This is how the grades will fall out. This is a normal distribution. This is just based on sort of natural talent in that domain, prior exposure, all those sorts of things. We are not trying to get a normal distribution. Do you know the way to get a normal distribution? The way to get a normal distribution is to be the worst possible instructor you can be, because that ensures that you'll get the greatest spread of achievement. That's not what we're trying to do. Your job or your goal as the teacher or instructor is to reduce the variation in achievement. Does that mean everybody's going to perform the same? No, but you don't want this. This is not our goal. This is not the goal. If you have this, that means you are a bad instructor. You didn't intervene. This is how nature sort of plays it out. This is how if you lined up everybody in this room according to height, you would get this. This is what mastery learning is about. It's about moving the distribution from this. We really want this. We want to decrease it. We want to shrink it. And the way we do that, and this has been studied. This has been studied over and over again. We have some units. We give an assessment. We have some sort of correctives, enhancements, enrichments. We give another assessment. And we move on. And what does that do? That shrinks the achievement distribution, which is what we're trying to get. It works. Now, it doesn't work without that middle piece. So if you give a test and just give another test, what do you think the score is going to be? It's going to be exactly the same. Right? How many of you knew somebody who retook the SATs or the ACTs or GREs like 10 times, but never did anything different in between? What happened? They get the same score every time, right? Without the intervention, without that feedback, there is no learning, there is no growth. But this is what the mastery model is about. Now, the people that have problems with the mastery model aren't really doing a mastery model. A mastery model is not, the student comes in, takes a test, and then they come back in and say, I want another test. That's not how it works. Intervention. People say, wow, why would somebody study? Why you study? Because you make them do correctives afterwards. And if anybody here has had to redo an assignment after doing it the first time, they understand that you quickly learn it is more of a pain to have to redo something than to focus on it right the first time. And so the people that have problems and these students abusing the system, and there's always going to be some students that abuse the system. So what? Doesn't mean we shouldn't allow this. We allow it anywhere else. How many times can you take the bar exam? Can you take it once? Maybe we should do that. You can only take the bar exam once. You can only take, the professional engineering exam once. You can only take ACTs once. If we really think that allowing retakes degrades sort of the values that we're instilling in people, then why do we do it in all these other realms? But you've got to have this part. If you don't have this part, results will be no different. And if we look at a meta-analysis of all the studies done on mastery learning approaches, these are the range of effect sizes. So you can see there's some bad implementations, but that's like anything. An implementation doesn't guarantee success. Implementation with fidelity is what gives you success. But look at the range. A lot of the stuff clusters right there in that 0.5, 0.6 effect size. So a lot of times in research, you'll hear people say it's statistically significant. How many of you have heard someone quote that before? They'll say it's statistically significant. Well, statistically significant doesn't tell you the size of the difference. If you give somebody 2 aspirin, it will statistically significantly reduce their pain. Is that how you would treat somebody with a broken leg? No. But we know that there is a statistical difference. When we talk about effect size, we talk about the magnitude of the difference. So effect sizes are in standard deviations, and it is extremely difficult to get anything in education to have an effect size greater than 0.2 or 0.3. Why? Because education is complex and there's so many factors in it. But look, this is what the research tells us about effect size, mastery learning, mastery approaches, giving students opportunities. So it's there. Now, just because it's there doesn't mean people will believe it, but it's sort of there for you. So I'm going to stop there for a second and give people a few minutes to think of questions. Now, I really don't want to I'm not here to get into questions about details about your specific case. I'm here to talk about sort of rethinking a big idea. So if you have a question related to something that's said, I would be more than happy to answer that. If you're going to talk about something specific that's happening with your kid, I'm not equipped to do that. But there's lots of people out here who are. And afterwards, maybe you can kind of talk to them. But yes?
Can you explain what that graph means?
Oh, yes, sir. So this means of all the studies that they did, where they compared a mastery approach to a traditional approach.
So the mastery is the LFM?
Yes. Well, there's actually two types of treatments they're using here. One is the learning from mastery. That's the one I showed you. The other one is actually from a technique called personalized system instruction, which is basically the same thing. You give students quizzes. They get feedback, they have interventions, and they retry. They were kind of two different brands, if you will, of approaches to mastery learning. But they're both considered sort of mastery learning approaches. So what this is showing you is the distribution of effect sizes from all the studies that were done in this area. And you see down the bottom, there were 67 studies done in personalized system instruction and 36 studies done in learning from mastery. But they're both centered around this idea of assessment, intervention, reassessment. And the results they're comparing are their students' performance on the final examinations in those courses. And so how do they perform in the final examinations? So in the comprehensive final examinations, we can see that we're getting very good effect sizes. So the median is sort of right there in the sort of that 0.5 area, which is a very good result.
So it's comparing those to PSI and LFM?
No, it's comparing the PSI to traditional and the LFM for traditional. These are both mastery approaches.
Where is the traditional?
The effect size tells us this. The effect size tells us that's the control group. So when we look at the effect size, we assume that it's being compared to control group of traditional. And when we say traditional, we mean no intervention, no feedback. Yes?
So with the mastery learning, I get it. It makes sense. The graphic. What kind of training have teachers had on the intervention and that in-between time from the first assessment to the second assessment? What are these teachers doing to even the field? Some teachers make it great at doing those enrichment and those correctives and the assessments before the second retake. It seems like now students are taking that piece, which probably is the most important piece of this whole mastery learning, and it's not being implemented.
Well, I would definitely say that there are people who are going to be stronger at it than others.
So, but as a district, as a whole, like in this program, I've read all the stuff online.
Okay.
How are they training the teachers? I mean, because we're shifting the paradigm of our thought and learning process. And not that I'm blaming teachers, because they are fabulous, but how are we switching it? What kind of workshops are we doing? What kind of learning to implement this is happening?
That is a very good question. That is not a question.
And I'll answer it.
I can, or Beth's going to answer that question. Beth, want the mic?
First of all, I also want to say that when Dr. Swan is done, I can also pull up some screenshots of Power School so that I can kind of show you what we can walk through those Power School reports. Yes, we've had a lot of staff development. We actually have, in the last 4 years as we've worked toward this, we have spent a lot of time working with teams of teachers that have been paid forward, like how to do appropriate interventions and corrections. As recently as this summer, every teacher was required to participate in a minimum of 3 hours of staff development. Many spent much more time than that. So 3 hours was the minimum requirement, but I would say on the average, we had some teachers spending 40 hours of participation, and they did that in exchange for some of those winter days. That is what we spent our time on. So they have had a lot of staff development. We do have, as part of the retake criteria that we developed, that was done by the teachers, saying like, can we at least put some criteria in place with retakes so that the student has to see us, they have to conference with us, so we have opportunities to talk with them about that. And that's also where we added that the homework had to be completed, so that teachers could also have an opportunity at that time to say, I can't give you really good feedback unless I see some of the work that you've been doing, so I can tell you what it is you do and do not understand. So we have spent a lot of time on doing that. I think if anybody else wants to speak to it, but again, people are in different places. We continue to work on it. As recently as today, teachers were working in their professional learning communities. They were talking about some of these very things. They've been calibrating assessments and saying, how do you score that? You know, do we have agreement on what that looks like? And I had the high school math team. One of the quotes that came out of that conversation was, this is the most precision we've ever used in being able to look at how we score an assessment. And we're doing, like the geometry teachers are looking at geometry tests together. The algebra teachers are looking at algebra, and they're talking about what the students are learning and what they need. So the conversations have been way richer than they have been in the past. And the teachers are seeing that and saying that.
Yes.
Yeah, my name's Mike Reese. I have 3 kids in the school district. I have a son in 8th grade who's taking advanced placements. I have a daughter in 6th grade who is struggling to even be at grade levels of special programs. So I come at it from a little different perspective. And I spent a lot of time researching, talking to people, and trying to understand the grading for learning. And as I understand it, one of the central themes is that we don't want to grade homework, we don't want to grade things like that, because it really doesn't show learning, and I understand that. But at the same time, that seems to imply that the summative assessments will reflect actual learning that's taking place. And there's a lot I really like after I dive into this process, but I struggle with one concept, and my significant concern is with this concept of recency, especially the way it's been implemented in TOSA, where only the 3 most recent grades on summative assessments, the benchmarks, are used to determine the final grade. And my concerns are twofold. One is that it actually could mask non-learning, and 2 is that it potentially provides a disincentive for learning or effort. And I think a lot of the parents I've talked to already heard their kids saying, well, I'm not going to worry about this test doesn't count. I've heard teachers say that kids are asking, hey, does this test count? And then sort of feeding how they study. But to the former, whereas my real concern is that the stated purpose of recency is that students are not punished for their developing learning earlier on. And as I understand it, whole number grading, non-binding formative assessments, and retake policy all are designed for that stated purpose. And it seems to me that the recency potentially masks non-learning. And the best way to explain that is a real example here. The 7th grade science, I don't know, 7th grade, but this came to my attention as I talked to parents, has 4 units: physics, chemistry, life science, and earth science. And I'm assuming that there's a summative assessment for each of teaching those classes. And if someone gets an F in physics and 3 A's in the following 3, that they get an A for the course, even though they got an F in chemistry. And my question is, I don't understand how mastering the benchmarks, and I have some of the benchmarks, a process to communicate ideas and scientific information, how achieving that benchmark on the final 3 assessments covers learning physics where they got an F. It seems to be a disconnect here, and I don't understand.
Okay, so that's a very good question. So when we think of designing summative assessments, a summative assessment doesn't necessarily just have to be on physics or chemistry or biology. Often what we do is people spiral items. So when you spiral an item, is you will pull them in. And you may have a summative assessment that straddles one or more big sort of domains or units. And so if we think about the assessments are always samples. So let's say we're going to have a summative assessment that's going to be based over these 3 or 4 units. So we have these targets we're trying to hit in each unit. But no matter what the assessment you're doing, whether you're talking about the AP, whether you're talking about the state exam, whether you're talking about the SAT, ACT, whatever you want to do, is we really sample, and we try to purposely sample across all of these things so we kind of get a spread of what's happening with that. And then we sort of build our summative assessments around that sample. You never assess every single target that you teach during the school year. Assessments would be way too long. They would take days to do. So, so if you were to test every single fact, figure, definition, process, example that you cover an entire course, you could not do that in a timely manner, right? If it takes you an entire year to teach and cover all this material, there's no way that you could assess it if you assessed every single thing that you did. And that, so like if you were to take the bar exam, because the bar exam tested every single thing that you learned in law school, it's samples, I would imagine. Same thing with engineering. It's sort of samples. So, but now when teachers design these things, right, they often will spiral items from previous assessments. And when we say spiral, that means they're going to pull some things in so they can keep going back and checking. So that's one way that they can address that particular issue. Now, I mean, you could argue that maybe in that scenario, you could argue if it's mass learning, maybe in that scenario that you gave, I would probably design those assessments a little bit differently. But, I think at the end of the day, Go ahead.
The example of
Can I say something?
Sure.
And then I'll be glad to talk with you about this afterwards, because I think this is a really specific question. But this comes to... I understand that, but we're going to talk about science,
So what it is, it's not science, the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the earth science are not discretely different. They're discretely different. What is the same in all of those units is the benchmarks. So the benchmarks are scientific modeling, data analysis, whatever those are, right? Okay, so what they're doing is they're creating assessments in physics, and they're teaching a lot of stuff you don't assess. We always teach more than we assess. We always have, and we always will have to, because you can't assess everything we teach. So when they're creating an assessment, they're really looking through the lens of those benchmarks and saying, what does scientific modeling look like in physics? So when I'm assessing for scientific modeling in physics, I'm assessing for scientific modeling in biology, in chemistry, and in earth science. So that's what the strand is that runs through it.
And I get that, the strand runs through it, but it doesn't translate that if you meet that strand in life sciences, that it shows any aptitude in physics. And if we're truly testing benchmarks, if someone gets an A and masters the benchmark in the first thing, and I say, well, let's move on then, because he's mastered that benchmark, then we'll say,
It's
No,
gonna,
it's like whack-a-mole. It doesn't hold together.
it's going to look different in each one of those things, that's true. But what is the same is that kids can connect their new learning to that prior learning with modeling. So even though it's modeling in physics, there are still some common characteristics that they can tie their learning to, and that's called background knowledge. So you use your background knowledge to teach the new modeling in the next unit, and now when I'm measuring it, it's new learning for them, but they have something they can tie it to, and then they introduce new concepts. So it's still scientific modeling, it's just in a different content or
I
context.
get that, but I don't see how that ties to the purpose of using the last few grades. That just escapes me.
Okay.
So, this notion of spiral, recency matters, right? Recency matters. So let's take these few scores here. Right? So in strand 2, the student gets a 1, 2, 3, 3, 3. What grade would you probably give that student? What if the scores were reversed? 3, 3, 3, 2, 1. Would you give the student the same scores? Probably not. And again, spiraling allows us, we don't have to not assess something. There's no rule that says you can't assess physics later. What if you give a comprehensive final? How many of you guys have had a comprehensive final in college or wherever, and the professor says, you know what, if you do well on this, I'll drop the earlier score? There's lots of different ways to get at it. Now, you could, if you designed it poorly, you could lead to exactly what you said, but I don't think that in itself, I don't think that is a absolute truth. It comes back to, like anything, design of your implementation. So you have all the time. And we've looked at the grade data. And especially the biggest problem in grade data is not the A. People think it's the easy A. It actually occurs around the B. And if you take something like B grades and compare them to how students do on, say, like the state exams, it can often be like almost a normal distribution. Right? So this is not going to decrease any sort of meaningfulness of the grades. In fact, based on the evidence I've looked at, the schools I've worked at, it's going to increase it. But I think that is a very good point. If they don't spiral it, that is problematic. If they don't go back for that student and address it, but they should be doing it through the intervention. And what you're kind of saying really speaks to the need to do that intervention and to do that reassessment. But we also have to be very thoughtful in how we design assessments so that we do give opportunities to go back and capture it. But there's lots of different ways to do that. There's not one way to do that. And I just gave the example of the comprehensive final. Because that's something we're all familiar with. That's exactly what the comprehensive final is trying to address. And why that is a perfect example of recency. They say, you know what, we're going to take this and we're going to replace or drop an earlier grade because recency matters.
If I just, one last comment. The often used analogy is that the summative assessment, the first one is learning to crawl, the next one is learning to walk holding someone's hand, and then for the final, the last summative assessment is actual walking, and if someone actually achieved walking, the other ones are relevant. But to me, how it seems to be implemented is we're taking, let's say, 13 tests on the 13 colonies, and it doesn't matter how you do on the test on the first 10 colonies because you get A's on the tests on the final 3 colonies, you achieve these benchmarks, and then it's no variant of what you learned in the first 10. So I get this concept of how it would work if you spiral it, that's the lingo, but I'm just concerned that that's not how it's being implemented here in the Tulsa schools.
I think that's a good point, Gerry. Yes?
And I agree with him that it seems to de-emphasize content in grades. It's more about the process, but that's not my question. In my Eastern High School, my son's power school, he's got 7 classes. 4 of them have no grades whatsoever. We're 6 weeks into school and he has maybe he's getting some feedback in class, but he's had nothing that
Well, what I would say there is the way I would kind of structure handling that is I would address that, and I'll give you an example from. Yes. Oh yes, I'm sorry.
You know, here at West today, about 2 weeks ago, I got an email from a parent who was saying, I love Grading for Learning, I agree with everything that you're doing, except I'm very frustrated. Basically, I heard parents over here say it, now you just say it that. And actually, I can admit, when I looked on our school, some of our students, I saw it. Some teachers had a 4 or a 3, some teachers had an A or a B, some teachers in teaching the same course, one had 14 grades in, one had 0. And the parents said, please look up my daughter. So I did, and I was, okay, I get it. So today at West, what we did, we had every teacher, we had what we call TICE, requirements, minimal requirements. And we also set up everything to be the same as far as if you're missing an assignment, some teachers were putting an MIS, some were putting a check, some were putting a green box. Now it's all going to be the same. And also for like the algebra team was saying, some teachers like to put in every homework assignment and every formative assessment grade. Others were not putting in much at all. So we decided we're going to have minimum levels. So each week, if you math teachers like to give homework almost every night, you have to at least put in 2 of the homework grades, and you have to put in every formative assessment that you do. So I agree, that's been frustrating for folks, and we're working on that. So I really think, and one of the things through this process that I've learned is being so transparent and open about it and taking the feedback. We've made some really good changes from the feedback we've gotten from parents, but I really want to assure you, the conversations that I'm hearing students with their teachers here at school, they are happening. Not in every classroom, and we still have a lot of work to do, but they're so much more rich than they used to be. We went through walkthroughs with a consultant. We were in 3 math classes where when the teacher handed back the formative assessment, they had grades. The students had grades for all 3 benchmarks. And so I just asked one student, he had a 2, a 2, and a 1. And I said, well, what, you know, last year you would have got a 50% on that. What would that have told you? I don't know. I said, well, what are you going to do here? And he looked at me and he goes, well, this one is the one I'm going to really concentrate on the most. And I have to get these 2s up to 3s to be proficient. We never had conversations like that before. And the other big thing that I heard Beth say that is really true, our teachers are breaking down assessments more than they ever have before and really trying to figure out what is it that students really need to learn, what are those essential understandings, but more importantly, they're starting to change their assessments because of it and have it more practical. And instead of just having things on there that are just total recall, almost all of our benchmarks are having the students do something. And then they use some of the content, the different types of content to go through and relearn those high leverage benchmarks. So yes, we're not where we want to be. We're going to continue. That's our focus during our PLCs. That's our focus for our building leadership teams. But I did want to point out for West at least, and I talked to Mr. Hughes about it tonight, those grade books will be getting better and better and better, and by parent-teacher conferences, they should all be up and going the way we want them to be.
You know, one thing, we're kind of nearing the end here, and one thing I want to keep encouraging all of you in this room to keep doing is to keep asking questions and keep pushing. But I work with a lot of schools, and one of the things I always do when I go around to schools is I've started asking them to say, well, tell me what your grades say in terms of how they match up with external measures. And this is a pretty typical profile. Right, so in Kentucky we have the state exams of distinguished, proficient, apprentice, novice. And when I go around to places, there's a lot of kids down that bottom corner. And they're down there because they aren't having those conversations about the complexity of the content and what an A means, and what a B means, and what do grades actually communicate about what a student can do, rather than compiling a calculation. They're not having those conversations. Right? Once they start having those conversations, the bottom corner starts to thin out. Doesn't happen immediately. Doesn't happen in year 1. Doesn't happen totally in year 2. Right? But it starts to thin out. Now you can have some districts that you have a bunch of kids up in that upper right corner. I actually talked with another district here in Wisconsin, and they have the exact opposite problem. They have a lot of kids up in that corner. They're failing a lot of kids. Right? But this is the current state of grading. This is the current state of grading. This is what it looks like. And I bet you look at that and you say, I'm okay with that. Then a lot of the stuff probably isn't for you. But this is problematic. This is why we have so much accountability testing in our schools today. Right? We have it because people have said, and this is it doesn't matter what state you go to, this is a great talking point. Say, well, teacher grades, they don't tell us anything. Well, that's not the problem. The problem is they're trying to tell us too many things. Well, everything that's going on in these efforts, if we're going to rethink grading, is we have to address this problem. I think that what's happening is really trying to address this particular issue. But I see this all the time. I see it in middle school, I see it in secondary school, I see it in elementary. So I hope as you keep going forward, that's the goal. Keep moving this stuff forward. It won't be right the first time. It never is. But it's not going to break anything. It's really not. It's not going to break anything. And anyone who tells you any different, I mean, if you look at the research, if you look at the alignment studies, they get hammered. Grades get hammered because of stuff like this. And this is not uncommon. If I were to spend time going around Wisconsin, I'd find exactly the same thing. I've seen it in some places already. This is what we're trying to address. Yes, the question up there.
So you mentioned elementary school, you mentioned middle school, high school, but what about college and continuous education? How are they adapting to this process? So what do you have our children go through this process for X number of years, and then all of a sudden they're trying to apply to these institutes of further education, and yet then they'll have to go back into these kind of traditional environments? I mean, do you see trends of these?
Oh, I see.
Learning are moving to this type of grading system? Because in my research, I'm not seeing it.
Well, there's different places. Well, let's put it this way. There's still places that grade on a curve. Does that mean we should grade on a curve? I had a law professor write me the other day, and he wrote an entire legal brief or whatever about how really all grades should be graded on the curve. You go to Duke's Business School, they have a recommendation policy that said, no class should have more than 24% of the students receiving A's. And so there's places like that. Now, those tend to be pretty highly competitive institutions, but it goes back to the purpose of the grades. I think the purpose of the grades of the Duke Business Schools is they want a competitive environment. They want students eating each other and competing with each other. But there are a lot of places that, in fact, a lot of these mastery models, those PSI studies, those are predominantly from colleges. If you go and look around, you may have heard of it's called the Emporium model. But a lot of entry-level math classes are moving to this sort of, okay, we need to assess, retake, we're grading on the assessments, we're giving students multiple opportunities. Does it happen across the board? No, but just because it's not being done at a place is no reason for our high schools and our middle schools and our elementary schools to not do it. I mean, just because someone else is doing bad practice and grading malpractice does not mean that our K-12 schools should partake in it. I don't believe that. Now there is lots of trends. People are realizing this. I can tell you at University of Kentucky, when you have 50% of the students fail your college algebra midterm exam, that raises questions. That has a president coming down saying, this is not okay. What we're doing here is not working. This is costing people money. So it's changing. It's going to change a lot more slowly than K-12, but it's changing. It'll be there. It'll get there.
Yeah, but we were told that we were going to this because the colleges are doing this. And if they are not, then why are we going to this?
Well, you're doing this because it's backward. Do you think that's acceptable?
No, but I'm saying.
Well, if you don't think it's acceptable, and and you want to keep doing it, I don't really think that's, I don't think that makes sense to me.
It doesn't make sense to me to go to this one. Colleges are not.
No, this is current. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. And college is a very different place. College is a very different place. But if you think about a lot of large enrollment undergraduate classes, what do they normally have? 2 midterms and a final. Do they care if you come to class? Nope. Care if you keep up with the work? Nope. They don't. How many kids flame out in their undergraduate years because they haven't learned the value of actually doing homework and practice? They've always been chasing the stick. I'm not carrot. It's great to make a stick too. It's kind of a stick and a carrot at the same time. But I just think that is the wrong argument to have. And people are changing. There's one more question. You.
I have a question, and it kind of goes back to the content in science classes. It seems to me that you're focusing a lot on standards and processes. Is content still important, especially in science and math, and especially in high school?
Oh, of course. You can't do a lot of, you can't do more complex questions without addressing the core disciplinary knowledge. I mean, it doesn't work that way. You can't do inquiry if you don't understand law of thermodynamics. You can't do those sorts of things unless you're doing that.
I absolutely agree, but it goes back to the gentleman in front of his question, is then how can you differentiate between photosynthesis and cell division in biology if you've got 4 units and you're only taking the last 3 subject assessments, then it seems to me that the content in that first or the last or whatever assessment you don't include is being downgraded.
Well, that's if you're not doing spiraling, if you don't have some sort of comprehensive measure, if you don't have some of these other mechanisms. But people can do that. People can do that. And, there's this question about, again, assessment is really a blunt sort of categorization. Our goal here is not to specifically parse out every particular thing. Now, you want to have a robust assessment that gives you a sense of where people are, but there's lots of different ways to address them. And so I think if you have poorly designed assessments, if you're not sort of thinking about this deliberately, what you're suggesting may exactly happen. But I'll counter with, there's tons of horrible things that happen in graded practice right now. Right? And this is a much better step in the direction. Right? This is a much better step in the direction. And when I look at the correlational studies I've done, doing this, you can get extremely great correlations up in 0.7s, high 0.7s, which is really, it's the highest you find in the literature is sort of 0.4, 0.5. So I think you're raising a critical point, but it's not something that can't be done. It's something that has to be kind of thought. And some people will trip, but some people make mistakes now anyway. So I don't think that's all right, one more, and then I'm going to wrap up. That's it.
Then what is the district doing to maintain, to ensure that we're doing the just spiraling and all of the assessments are going to be?
Well, I think that's what Beth talked about with the POC work.
That's what the benchmarks are the spiraling. And every single content area does have a content benchmark. And one of the things I also want to make clear is that in courses like science and math, so math, for example, their most recent scores, but it does not mean that all 3 of the scores are going to come from the assessment that's given in January at the end of the semester. So one score
Now, more is not better. More is not better, because when you get to assessments, if you look at the very definition of a summative assessment, and if you look at any major exam, any sort of credentialing exam, it is summative in that it is broad. It is broad and it's comprehensive, because at the end of the day, you're not interested if a student can show a discrete skill at this point in time and this point in time. You want to see that they can pull all of this stuff together in a big, broad way. And so, yes, you want to have lots of opportunities for assessment, but those opportunities need to be diagnostic. They need to be their purpose is to diagnose and to treat. Right? The summative assessments are more there to judge. And this is why it's absolutely important that the district is doing the retake. They're not making it optional. They're saying, no, this is policy. This is important, because it's important that you get these things right. Right? It's important that you get these things right. And we know it's not going to happen without that piece of the thing. I'm going to hang around for a little bit before I head out, but I want to thank everybody for coming out. And I want to thank Wauwatosa Schools for having me.
Yeah, I also want to say thank you for coming. I just want to stick to the point of making sure that you're communicating. When you look at grading, the conversations that have been taking place regarding grading, they haven't happened before. Not like what is going on right now. I think of some of the concerns that have been brought up in the past, and it would be going to the teacher to say, my son or daughter was 1 point away from an A, what do I need to do to get that 1 point, or can we make that, they're a good student, let's give them those A's. And I think the grading conversations were very superficial. 580 teachers in our school district, and to get anybody to be consistent with what we're doing, it's a huge, huge undertaking. I think we're doing a good job with it. I think the feedback from parents and from students, and not always the positive feedback, the negative feedback is where we really get growth. And the tough questions are what we need to continue to keep going to teachers, to principals, to myself, to everybody at central office. That's how we're going to nail this and get this right. I think we're in a good place. As a parent, I feel very confident. My kids aren't in high school yet, they're in middle school, but they know what's going on. They come home and they're talking about it. So it's happening. I feel comfortable as a parent with it. I feel confident that we're going to grow in the right places as a superintendent of the school district, but I also encourage you to continue the questions and the conversation regarding grading. I know we're never going to be able to answer and come to agreement on everything. We never have with anything in education, but we want to make sure we're answering your questions so you're confident with what's going on in the classrooms and confident with grading. So, like Dr. Swan, we'll be around. I know the 4 secondary principals are here, as well as some of the associate principals and people from teaching and learning to answer your questions. So thank you again for coming.